discussion that moves forward, when people talk about the Twitter revolution, or the Facebook revolution, or the Al Jazeera revolution, we always seem to ascribe these revolutions to the technologies or to the new tools. But what occurred in Tunisia and Egypt didn't originate in Silicon Valley or with the big broadcasters that were broadcasting these events. Instead, these revolutions came from the streets of Tunis, from the streets of Cairo. They were, if you wanted one thing to ascribe these revolutions to, it would be the youth of Egypt and the youth of Tunisia. And it was these youth that led these revolutions. And these revolutions didn't just occur on a single day, or didn't occur just in 2011. There were frustrations that were pent up for decades and decades. People were working against governments, working against regimes. In Egypt, it was not just 30 years of Mubarak rule, but it was a specter of a further 30 years of rule by his son that finally let the gates open. But to understand the spectacle and to understand why people keep attributing this revolution to Twitter and to Facebook and to Al Jazeera, there's obviously something there. It points to the role that the media played during those revolutions. So to tell you the story of the media and to tell you the story of the protesters, I'll take you back to the 25th of January. I'll take you back to the day that the protests broke out in Egypt. This was just under 2 weeks after Ben Ali had fled Tunisia. And what we saw, I'll take you to this video, and I'm sure everybody's seen this video and seen these clips. The iconic clip of an Egyptian youth standing out in front against the water cannon. And this clip was one of the first pieces of media to be shown across people's computer screens on the 25th of January. This became the most watched video that was produced over the entire 18 days of Egypt. And what's impressive about this video was not the quality of the footage. It was taken by somebody standing on a balcony of a building with their mobile phone. It was not that it was this event, the spectacle of a person standing in front of this water cannon. Now, somebody who took this video produced this video themselves on their mobile phone. They uploaded it onto YouTube. This video was then distributed totally independent of the mainstream media. It was distributed independently of all the broadcasters in the world and all the news networks. It was discovered on Facebook. People in Egypt and the rest of the world found it on YouTube. They were searching for it in Google. And that's how this piece of content, this one unit, spread and captured the imagination of both the 80 million of the Egyptians and of the rest of the world. But what we saw from this moment, on the 25th of January, it was almost a reprogramming of media networks. Because what we saw was the protesters themselves, the people of Egypt, take media, make media themselves, reflected their own ideas, their own values, and then push that out to the rest of the world, independent of any other, independent of the state, independent of broadcasters, and independent of anyone else. And what that caused, what that first day caused, and what this video and others like it caused, the reflection on the ground, the reflection of these protests, of these young people and their aspirations. We moved from this one spectacle that occurred on the 25th of January into what would become a spectacular event. This was 18 days of non-stop coverage, 18 days of 24/7 news cameras rolling in Tahrir Square, 18 days of youth and Egyptians coming to Tahrir, occupying the square, calling for nothing more than the end of the regime. And you couldn't escape this. Whether you put on your television, you opened up your phone and opened up Twitter or Facebook, this spectacular was with you. So for 18 days, media became all-consuming. So to understand how we moved from this one video into this 24/7 coverage, it leads us to look back at the role of that video, which, as I said, on that day, it was the most viewed video. It wasn't a video created by Al Jazeera or by any other broadcaster or mainstream media network. It was a video created by a citizen, far outstripping anything created by the professionals. And what this led to, as we moved from the spectacle to the spectacular, was we reprogrammed our communication networks, as Manuel Castells had theorized, where people on the street had taken over, and they had taken the state's version of events, what the state for the last 30 years had produced and reproduced as common sense of what's acceptable, and they had smashed it in a day. So to understand this, we understand three networks that emerged in Egypt. We understand the protest networks These protesters that have been for 10 years pushing the limits in the state, coming out onto the streets, honing their tactics, evangelizing. We understand the mass media network that reached the majority of Egyptians. Everybody in Egypt watched Al Jazeera. And then we understand the internet and the social media sphere. That was, maybe 20% of the population in Egypt, but an important segment of the population, those organizing the protests. And when you understand all of these three, then you can understand the role of the media. The role of the media in reflecting what the protesters were doing, in reinforcing what the protesters were doing. Because people would see through the media what these youth on the streets were doing, their parents would see it, and they then themselves would come out onto the streets to support these youth. And the state recognized this as well. The regime responded to all three of these networks. They responded to the protesters by attacking the protesters. Everyone remembers the 2nd of February, the Battle of Tahrir Square, when horses and camels were used by regime thugs to try to disperse the protesters. The regime responded to the internet and social media sphere by shutting down mobile services first, and then shutting off the entire internet, making the country black towards the rest of the world, where no one could check their email or upload a YouTube video. And they tried to disrupt the mainstream media and traditional media networks. They harassed journalists. They destroyed their equipment. They even jammed our satellite signals. But each time the regime responded and attacked one of these particular networks, whether it be the protesters, the internet, or the mainstream media, the other two networks lit up. When the protesters were attacked, the media picked this up and broadcast this, and this caused people to flock towards the media network. So what happened was each of these networks empowered the other. Each of these networks reinforced the other. And at that critical juncture, it was when the regime's control over information completely collapsed. When any idealization that the regime had, any authority, any power, collapsed and was gone. But what's important now, when we look back at the coverage, because the coverage of this occurred on every platform. It was on Twitter, it was on Facebook, on YouTube, it was broadcast 24/7, it was going live, and you couldn't escape it. And we always talk when we start producing new pieces of content, when we start looking at new media, we always flock to what's shiny and new. We often talk about aggregation and curation and visualization. But it's important to always remember that behind all of that, behind every tweet that we put out, that we republish, that we retweet, lies the people. Lies those youth in Tahrir Square, lies the journalists who go out and risk their lives to bring you the news. So fundamentally, it's that storytelling technique. It's the person who goes out to get the news, be they a citizen or be they a professional, that lies behind everything that we've seen. It's not the tools, it's not the technologies, but it's the story and the human being at the center of those stories. And this is ever more important because Tunisia and Egypt represented hope. We saw young people come out demanding that the regime change, demanding a better future, demanding the end to authoritarian rule. But when we think now of Libya and Syria, it's a different narrative. It's not peaceful revolution anymore. We often see violence, we see the brutality of the state, and we're starting to see armed struggle. And these bring out different challenges, but challenges that are important for us as journalists and to reflect, just as they're important for the citizens of those countries to get their message out. And when we think of what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Syria and Libya, sometimes journalists pay the ultimate price. Our own cameraman, Ali Jaber, was killed in Libya. We've had journalists kidnapped in Libya. We had one of our journalists in Syria go missing for 18 days at the hands of the regime. So journalists take these risks, but they don't take these risks for themselves or for fame or for glory, but they take them to reflect the stories of people who are being affected by them. And ultimately, that's what our role is. Away from the veneer of technology and tools and tweets, it's a story of a people. And it's how we reflect that story and how we reflect their aspirations. Thank you.